Welcome to Sinister Memory, where we unearth the most chilling and inexplicable events from the forgotten corners of our nation's past. If you're new here, sign up now and join a community that seeks truth in the shadows of history. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your story matters too. Let's get to today's case. The earliest known record of Nathaniel Whitmore's unusual abilities appears in a letter dated March 15th, 1862, written by his father, Dr. Ezra Whitmore, to his brother-in-law, Professor Thomas Caldwell of Harvard University. Dr. Whitmore, a physician who had established a small practice in the isolated settlement of Millbrook Hollow, Vermont, was not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. The letter, discovered in 2019 among Professor Caldwell's preserved correspondence, reads with the measured tone of a man of science struggling to comprehend an impossible reality. Dr. Whitmore describes his son as having developed normally until his 5th birthday in February of 1862, when the boy began speaking what the father initially dismissed as gibberish. However, within days, it became apparent that young Nathaniel was speaking fluent Latin, a language to which he had never been exposed. The remote location of Millbrook Hollow, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by a single dirt road that became impassable during winter months, made this development all the more perplexing. The nearest town, with a church that might have conducted Latin services, lay 30 miles away, and the Whitmore family had not travelled there in over 2 years due to Dr. Whitmore's demanding practice and his wife's delicate health following a difficult pregnancy the previous year. According to the physician's careful documentation, Nathaniel would speak exclusively in Latin for hours at a time, often while staring at fixed points in empty rooms or at the forest beyond their windows. The child's mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, became increasingly distressed by these episodes, which she described in her own journal as being accompanied by a noticeable drop in temperature throughout their modest farmhouse. Dr. Whitmore's medical training led him to consider various explanations for his son's condition. He meticulously recorded the boy's behavior, noting that Nathaniel appeared fully conscious during these episodes, but seemed unaware of his family's presence. The child's Latin speech patterns, as transcribed by his father, who had studied the language during his medical education, demonstrated a sophistication that far exceeded what any 5-year-old should possess, regardless of their exposure to the ancient tongue. The physician's letter to Professor Caldwell reveals his growing concern about his son's condition and his desperate hope that his brother-in-law, a respected scholar of ancient languages, might provide some rational explanation. Dr. Whitmore included several pages of phonetic transcriptions of his son's Latin utterances, noting that the boy seemed to be reciting passages that felt familiar, yet could not be identified in any classical texts the physician could access. Perhaps most disturbing to Dr. Whitmore was his observation that these episodes always occurred during the same hours, between sunset and the deepest part of night, and that they had begun to attract attention from the local wildlife. He noted with scientific precision that during Nathaniel's Latin recitations, unusual numbers of ravens would gather in the trees surrounding their property, remaining silent and motionless until the boy returned to speaking English. The letter concludes with Dr. Whitmore's plea for his brother-in-law to visit Millbrook Hollow at the earliest opportunity, though he acknowledges that the spring thaw would not make the journey possible until late April at the earliest. This sense of isolation, of being trapped with an increasingly inexplicable situation, permeates every line of the physician's careful prose, revealing a man whose rational worldview was beginning to crack under the weight of his son's impossible abilities. What Dr. Whitmore could not have known was that his letter would be one of the last pieces of normal correspondence to emerge from Millbrook Hollow for the remainder of that fateful year. Professor Thomas Caldwell's response to his brother-in-law's urgent letter has been preserved in the Harvard University archives, filed among his personal papers following his death in 1899. Dated April 3, 1862, the professor's reply demonstrates the measured skepticism of an academic confronted with claims that challenged his understanding of human development and linguistic acquisition. Caldwell, who held the distinguished position of Professor of Classical Languages at Harvard, had devoted his career to the study of Latin and Greek texts. His initial reaction to Dr. Whitmore's letter mixed familial concern with scholarly doubt. He diplomatically suggested that young Nathaniel might have overheard Latin prayers or hymns during a church service, storing the sounds in his developing mind and repeating them without understanding their meaning. However, the transcriptions Dr. Whitmore had included troubled Professor Caldwell deeply. His expertise allowed him to recognize that the Latin phrases were not random recitations from common prayers or classical texts, but rather seemed to be fragments of something far older and more obscure. Some passages appeared to reference astronomical events and seasonal transitions, while others contained references to what Caldwell described as pre-Christian invocations of uncertain origin. The professor's concern overcame his academic obligations, and he arranged to travel to Vermont as soon as the mountain roads became passable. His journey to Millbrook Hollow, documented in a detailed travel journal found among his effects, reveals the increasing sense of unease that accompanied his approach to the remote settlement. Caldwell departed Boston on April 28, 1862, traveling by rail to White River Junction before continuing by hired carriage into the Vermont mountains. His journal entries from this period note the unusual behavior of his horses as they drew closer to Millbrook Hollow. The animals became increasingly agitated as the road narrowed and the forest closed in around them, requiring frequent stops to calm them despite the mild spring weather. The professor's first glimpse of the Whitmore property came at sunset on April 30th. His journal describes a modest but well-maintained farmhouse situated in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward toward the structure. What struck Caldwell immediately was the absolute silence that surrounded the property. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, nothing but the sound of wind through the upper branches of the trees. Dr. Whitmore greeted his brother-in-law with evident relief, though Caldwell noted that the physician appeared to have aged considerably since their last meeting 2 years prior. Mrs. Whitmore, whom the professor remembered as a vibrant woman with a ready smile, now seemed withdrawn and anxious, frequently glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something in the gathering darkness. Young Nathaniel appeared normal during the daylight hours of Caldwell's first day at the property. The boy played quietly with simple wooden toys, responded appropriately to questions in English, and showed no signs of the unusual behavior his father had described. Professor Caldwell began to suspect that his journey had been prompted by nothing more than parental anxiety over normal childhood development. This complacency evaporated as the sun set behind the towering pines. As shadows lengthened across the farmhouse floor, Nathaniel's demeanor began to change. The child became still and focused, his gaze fixing on the darkened windows with an intensity that made Professor Caldwell profoundly uncomfortable. When the boy finally began to speak, the Latin that flowed from his young lips was unlike anything the scholar had encountered in 30 years of academic study. Caldwell's journal entry from that evening, written in handwriting that becomes increasingly erratic as the night progressed, describes Latin phrases that seemed to shift and change even as he attempted to transcribe them. The professor, whose expertise in the ancient language was unquestioned, found himself struggling to understand passages that appeared to be grammatically correct, yet somehow wrong in ways he could not articulate. Most disturbing to the scholar was his growing certainty that young Nathaniel was not simply reciting memorized text, but was actively constructing complex Latin sentences that responded to elements in his environment. When an owl called from the forest, the boy's Latin shifted to include references to nocturnal watchers. When the wind picked up, his words incorporated phrases about voices carried on mountain air. Professor Caldwell's final journal entry from Millbrook Hollow, dated May 3, 1862, reveals a man whose scholarly confidence had been thoroughly shaken. He wrote of feeling as though he were witnessing something that predated the classical Latin he had studied, something that reached back to linguistic traditions that had been deliberately forgotten by civilized society. Dr. Ezra Whitmore's medical journal, recovered from the ruins of the Millbrook Hollow farmhouse in 1923, provides the most detailed day-by-day account of his son's deteriorating condition throughout the summer of 1862. The physician's training compelled him to document every observable symptom and behavior change, creating a record that reads like a case study of an impossible medical phenomenon. Following Professor Caldwell's hasty departure on May 4th, the scholar left without explanation, claiming urgent business at Harvard. Dr. Whitmore found himself alone with a situation that defied medical understanding. His journal entries from this period reveal a man attempting to apply scientific method to supernatural circumstances, measuring and recording phenomena that had no place in 19th century medicine. The physician noted that Nathaniel's Latin episodes were becoming more frequent and intense. What had initially occurred only during evening hours now extended well into the night, with the boy often found standing motionless in his bedroom, speaking to the darkness beyond his window until dawn broke over the mountain ridges. Dr. Whitmore recorded that his son's voice during these episodes possessed a resonance that seemed impossible for a child's vocal cords to produce. More troubling to the physician were the physical changes he observed in his son. Nathaniel's weight began to decrease despite normal appetite during daylight hours. His skin took on a pallor that no amount of sunshine seemed to alleviate, and his eyes developed a depth that Dr. Whitmore described as looking through rather than at the world around him. The boy's pulse during Latin episodes slowed to a rate that should have indicated serious medical distress, yet he showed no other signs of physical weakness. Dr. Whitmore's scientific background led him to consider various medical explanations for his son's condition. He consulted every medical text in his possession, searching for documented cases of childhood linguistic disorders or neurological conditions that might explain Nathaniel's abilities. His journal reveals a growing frustration with the inadequacy of contemporary medical knowledge to address what he was witnessing. The physician's documentation became increasingly detailed as summer progressed. He noted that the Latin recitations followed specific patterns tied to lunar phases, with the longest and most complex episodes occurring during the new moon. Dr. Whitmore began timing these sessions with a pocket watch, recording that they lasted exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes, regardless of when they began. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Whitmore documented changes in the environment surrounding their home during Nathaniel's episodes. The temperature inside the farmhouse would drop by 10 to 15 degrees, even during the warmest summer nights. Candles would flicker without any detectable air movement, and the family's animals, chickens, a milk cow, and their border collie, would refuse to enter the house after sunset. The physician's medical training extended to botanical knowledge, and he noted with growing alarm that the vegetation immediately surrounding their property began to change throughout the summer. Plants that had thrived in the clearing for years started to wither despite adequate rainfall and soil conditions. More disturbing, new growth appeared overnight, strange, pale fungi that seemed to glow with their own dim light and released spores that made the entire family feel nauseated when inhaled. Dr. Whitmore's journal reveals his increasing concern for his wife's mental state during this period. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had begun experiencing severe insomnia, claiming that she could hear voices calling her name from the forest during Nathaniel's Latin episodes. The physician prescribed mild sedatives from his medical supplies, but noted that they seemed to have little effect on her condition. By late August, Dr. Whitmore's journal entries show signs of the strain he was experiencing. His handwriting, normally precise and legible, became erratic and difficult to read. He began to question his own perceptions, wondering if the isolation of Millbrook Hollow had affected his ability to observe and record accurately. Yet the consistency of his measurements and the detailed nature of his documentation suggest a man fighting to maintain scientific objectivity in the face of inexplicable phenomena. The physician's final detailed journal entry from this period, dated September 15th, 1862, describes an episode that shook his rational worldview to its foundation. During one of Nathaniel's longest Latin recitations, Dr. Whitmore claimed to observe what he described as shadows moving independent of any light source throughout their home. These shadows, he wrote, seemed to respond to the boy's words, gathering and dispersing in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. Dr. Whitmore's journal from this night concludes with a statement that reveals the depth of his desperation. I fear that my son is no longer speaking Latin, but that Latin, or something far older, is speaking through him. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore's personal diary, discovered hidden beneath floorboards during the 1923 excavation of the farmhouse ruins, provides an intimate and increasingly disturbing account of life in Millbrook Hollow during the final months before Nathaniel's disappearance. Written in a delicate hand that gradually becomes more urgent and erratic, her entries offer a perspective on the family's ordeal that differs markedly from her husband's clinical observations. Eleanor's diary begins innocuously enough, with entries from early spring 1862 focusing on domestic concerns, the challenges of maintaining a household in such an isolated location, her hopes for her son's education, and her pride in her husband's dedication to serving the scattered families of the mountain region. Her love for young Nathaniel shines through every early entry, describing a bright and affectionate child who brought joy to their remote existence. The first mention of her son's unusual behavior appears in a diary entry dated March 18, 1862, just 3 days after Dr. Whitmore's letter to Professor Caldwell. Eleanor's account differs from her husband's measured medical observations, focusing instead on the emotional impact of witnessing her child speak in a language that seemed to transform his very essence. She wrote of feeling as though her son became a stranger during his Latin episodes, describing eyes that looked at her without recognition and a voice that carried tones no child should possess. Eleanor's maternal instincts told her that something fundamental had changed in Nathaniel, something that went far beyond the linguistic phenomenon that fascinated her husband and his scholarly brother-in-law. As spring turned to summer, Eleanor's diary entries reveal a woman struggling with mounting terror and isolation. She described nights when Nathaniel's Latin recitations seemed to be answered by sounds from the forest, not animal calls, but what she characterized as voices speaking in harmony with words I could not understand but somehow feared. Her descriptions of these nocturnal choruses create an atmosphere of dread that permeates every page of her diary. The young mother's entries from June and July 1862 document her growing conviction that their home had become the center of something ancient and malevolent. She wrote of dreams that felt more real than waking life, in which she found herself walking through the forest surrounding their property, drawn by the sound of Nathaniel's voice, speaking Latin phrases that seemed to call forth responses from the darkness between the trees. Eleanor's diary reveals her desperate attempts to maintain normalcy during daylight hours. She continued her household routines with obsessive precision, as if the familiar rhythm of domestic tasks could protect her family from the supernatural forces she felt gathering around them. Her descriptions of preparing meals, tending their small garden, and mending clothes take on an almost ritualistic quality, as though these mundane activities were protective charms against the darkness that claimed her son each night. Perhaps most heartbreaking are Eleanor's entries describing her attempts to reach Nathaniel during his episodes. She wrote of trying to embrace him while he spoke Latin, only to find that her son's body felt cold as winter stone and as unmovable as the mountain itself. Her maternal love compelled her to continue these attempts night after night, even as they left her feeling drained and increasingly disconnected from reality. The diary entries from August reveal Eleanor's growing paranoia about their isolation. She began to suspect that their situation was not accidental, writing of her belief that something in the mountains had specifically drawn them to Millbrook Hollow. She questioned whether her husband's decision to establish his practice in such a remote location had been entirely his own, or whether they had been guided there by forces they could not comprehend. Eleanor's deteriorating mental state becomes evident in her September entries, which describe episodes of lost time and fragmentary memories of activities she could not clearly recall. She wrote of finding herself standing in the forest at dawn, wearing only her nightgown, with no memory of how she had gotten there. Her feet would be cut and dirty, suggesting that she had walked considerable distances through the wilderness. Yet she retained no conscious recollection of these nocturnal journeys. The final complete diary entry, dated October 12, 1862, reveals a woman on the edge of complete psychological collapse. Eleanor wrote of her conviction that Nathaniel was no longer truly her son, but had become a vessel for something that had been waiting in the mountains for centuries. She described her growing certainty that their family had been chosen for a purpose she dared not try to understand. Her last coherent words, scrawled across the bottom of the final page in handwriting barely recognizable as her own, read, "The forest knows his name now. It calls to him in voices older than Latin, older than words. I fear what will answer when he finally understands what they want." The convergence of testimonies from the autumn of 1862 creates a portrait of a family and community in the grip of supernatural terror. Multiple sources from this period, including letters from neighboring families, reports from itinerant traders, and the scattered final entries in Dr. Whitmore's medical journal, paint a consistent picture of mounting dread as October progressed toward its inevitable climax. The Reverend Josiah Clemens, who served the scattered mountain communities through monthly circuit rides, provided one of the most detailed accounts of the situation at Millbrook Hollow during this critical period. His report to the Methodist Episcopal Church, filed on October 20th, 1862, describes his final visit to the Whitmore property on October 10th, a visit that would prove to be the last outside contact with the family. Reverend Clemens wrote of arriving at the farmhouse to find Dr. Whitmore in a state of profound agitation. The physician, normally meticulous in his appearance and demeanor, appeared haggard and unkempt, speaking in disjointed sentences about phenomena that the Reverend initially dismissed as symptoms of mountain fever or overwork. However, as the minister's account reveals, his skepticism evaporated as night fell over Millbrook Hollow. The Reverend's description of young Nathaniel's evening transformation provides crucial corroboration of the family's accounts. Clemens wrote of witnessing the boy's transition from normal childhood behavior to what he characterized as a vessel for unholy utterances that chilled the very air around us. The minister, whose Latin education was sufficient to recognize the language, if not always the meaning, confirmed that Nathaniel spoke with a fluency and sophistication impossible for any child. Most significantly, Reverend Clemens noted that the boy's Latin recitations seemed to be directed toward the forest surrounding the property, as if he were conducting a conversation with unseen entities dwelling among the trees. The minister described a growing sense that something vast and alien was listening to the child's words and responding through subtle changes in the environment, shifts in air pressure, variations in the sound of wind through the pines, and alterations in the quality of darkness itself. Dr. Whitmore's final journal entries from this period, fragmentary and sometimes illegible, reveal a man whose scientific worldview had completely collapsed. His October 15th entry describes elaborate preparations he and his wife had undertaken to protect their son from what they now understood to be supernatural forces. These included the placement of iron objects around Nathaniel's bedroom, the burning of specific herbs that Dr. Whitmore had learned about from local folk traditions, and desperate attempts to pray in languages they hoped might be older and more powerful than Latin. The physician's medical training led him to document physical changes in all three family members during this period. He noted significant weight loss in himself and his wife, despite continued attempts to maintain regular meals. Their sleep patterns had become completely disrupted, with all family members experiencing shared nightmares featuring vast forests where ancient voices called out in languages that predated human civilization. Perhaps most disturbing were Dr. Whitmore's observations about the transformation of their immediate environment. The clearing around their farmhouse, which had remained stable for the 5 years since their arrival, began to show signs of being reclaimed by the forest. New growth appeared overnight, saplings and undergrowth that seemed to move closer to the house each day, as if the wilderness itself were slowly closing in around them. Local testimonies from this period, collected years later by investigators, describe unusual phenomena observed throughout the broader region. Hunters reported finding circular clearings deep in the forest where all vegetation had died, leaving behind soil that felt warm to the touch, even as autumn temperatures dropped toward freezing. Trappers described hearing choruses of voices speaking in unison during the darkest hours of night, voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. The Henderson family, whose farm lay 8 miles south of Millbrook Hollow, reported that their livestock had become increasingly agitated throughout October, often breaking free from their enclosures to flee deeper into the mountains. James Henderson's letter to his brother in Burlington, dated October 18th, describes entire flocks of birds departing the region en masse, creating formations that blocked out the sun for hours at a time. Most ominous were the reports from travelers on the mountain road leading to Millbrook Hollow. Multiple sources describe encountering sections of the route where their horses and mules would refuse to proceed, forcing travelers to abandon their attempts to reach the isolated settlement. These accounts consistently mention a sensation of being watched from the forest and hearing distant voices that seemed to speak in multiple languages simultaneously. The final documented contact with the Whitmore family comes from a letter Dr. Whitmore managed to send via a passing trader on October 23, 1862. This brief message, addressed to his brother in Boston, consists of only a few sentences written in obviously shaking handwriting. Nathaniel speaks now in languages older than Latin. The forest has learned his name. We cannot leave. Something comes at the new moon. Pray for us. The events of October 28, 1862, the night of the new moon, remain one of the most thoroughly documented yet incomprehensible incidents in the annals of Vermont's supernatural history. Multiple witnesses from surrounding areas provided corroborating accounts of phenomena that challenged every rational explanation, creating a record that has defied interpretation for over a century and a half. The first indication that something extraordinary was occurring came from the Henderson farm, 8 miles distant from Millbrook Hollow. James Henderson's testimony, recorded 3 days after the event, describes being awakened near midnight by what he initially believed to be an earthquake. However, the rhythmic nature of the tremors, combined with their seemingly purposeful pattern, quickly convinced him that geological activity could not explain what he was experiencing. Henderson reported that the tremors corresponded with sounds emanating from the direction of Millbrook Hollow, a deep, resonant humming that seemed to arise from the earth itself. This sound, which he described as resembling the voices of 1,000 men speaking words in perfect unison, could be felt as much as heard, causing vibrations that shook loose objects from shelves throughout his farmhouse. Similar accounts came from other families within a 20-mile radius of the Whitmore property. The Morrison family, located 12 miles to the east, described their children awakening in terror as the humming sound penetrated the walls of their home. Mrs. Sarah Morrison's letter to her sister provides particularly vivid details of the night's events, describing how the sound seemed to carry words in multiple languages, creating harmonies that hurt to contemplate yet were impossible to ignore. Perhaps most significantly, multiple witnesses reported seeing lights moving through the forest in organized patterns during the hours between midnight and dawn. These were not the random flickers of fireflies or the steady glow of lanterns, but coordinated illuminations that moved in geometric formations through the trees, converging from all directions toward the location of Millbrook Hollow. The Reverend Josiah Clemens, who was conducting evening prayers at the Bradshaw homestead 15 miles south of the hollow, provided the most detailed account of the visual phenomena. His official report describes columns of pale, blue-white light that rose from the forest canopy like pillars supporting an invisible roof. These lights pulsed in rhythm with the humming sound that filled the mountain air, creating a synchronized display that the minister characterized as utterly alien to God's natural order. What makes these testimonies particularly compelling is their consistency across multiple independent sources. Families who had no communication with each other during the events all described the same phenomena. The rhythmic tremors, the multilingual humming, the organized light displays, and most disturbing of all, the absolute silence that fell over the mountains at exactly 3:17 a.m. This silence was not merely the absence of sound, but what witnesses described as the active suppression of all natural noise. The constant background sounds of the forest, wind through leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, the settling and creaking of wooden structures, all ceased simultaneously, creating an auditory void that several witnesses described as more frightening than the preceding supernatural display. James Henderson's account provides perhaps the most unsettling detail of this period of silence. He reported that, during these quiet hours, he attempted to venture outside his farmhouse to investigate the phenomena more closely. However, upon opening his door, he discovered that the air itself seemed to resist movement, creating an invisible barrier that prevented him from leaving his property. Other witnesses reported similar experiences, describing a sensation that the very atmosphere had become solid and impermeable. The silence persisted until sunrise, when normal sounds gradually returned to the mountain region. However, the dawn of October 29th revealed changes that would mark the landscape for decades to come. Travelers who ventured toward Millbrook Hollow in the following days reported finding the road completely impassable, not due to fallen trees or landslides, but because the forest had somehow reclaimed the entire route overnight. Where the path had once wound through the mountains, visitors found mature trees that appeared to have grown to full size in a single night. The soil showed no signs of recent planting or disturbance, yet the forest now formed an impenetrable barrier that made access to the hollow impossible through conventional means. Local guides who had known the route for decades claimed that the very topography of the region had altered, with familiar landmarks displaced or eliminated entirely. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the clearing where the Whitmore farmhouse had stood was now occupied by a grove of ancient pines that showed clear signs of having grown undisturbed for centuries. These trees, which had certainly not existed 24 hours earlier, formed a perfect circle around what would have been the location of the family's home. their trunks so massive that it would have taken 5 grown men with linked arms to encircle the smallest among them. Search parties organized in the following weeks found no trace of the Whitmore family or their possessions. No foundations, no debris, no personal effects. Nothing remained to indicate that anyone had ever lived in the remote mountain hollow. It was as if the entire family and their homestead had been erased from existence, leaving behind only a forest that seemed far older than the geological record would suggest possible. The disappearance of the Whitmore family prompted the most extensive search operation in Vermont's recorded history, mobilizing resources from local militia units, church organizations, and volunteer groups throughout the region. Led by Sheriff Marcus Bellwood of Montpelier, the effort to locate any trace of Dr. Ezra Whitmore, his wife Eleanor, and young Nathaniel would span 3 months and involve over 200 searchers. Sheriff Bellwood's official report, filed with the Vermont State Legislature in February 1863, provides a comprehensive account of the search efforts and their increasingly troubling findings. The sheriff, a practical man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, approached the investigation with methodical determination that gradually gave way to bewilderment and, ultimately, barely concealed terror. The first challenge facing the search teams was gaining access to Millbrook Hollow itself. The road that had provided the only route to the Whitmore property now lay completely blocked by forest growth that defied every attempt at clearing. Teams armed with axes and saws found that cutting through the newly grown trees required extraordinary effort, with tools becoming dull after only minutes of use and progress measured in feet rather than yards. More disturbing was the discovery that cleared sections of the path would be found completely regrown when search teams returned the following day. Trees that had been cut down to stumps would stand tall and mature by morning, showing no signs of recent disturbance. This phenomenon, witnessed by dozens of searchers, forced Sheriff Bellwood to post guards at cleared sections in futile attempts to prevent the overnight regrowth. The search teams that finally penetrated to the location of the former Whitmore homestead found a site that challenged their understanding of natural processes. The grove of ancient pines that now occupied the clearing showed characteristics that local botanists declared impossible. Growth ring analysis suggested the trees were several centuries old, yet multiple witnesses could attest that the clearing had been free of such growth only weeks before. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a botanist from the University of Vermont who joined the search effort, documented peculiarities in the grove that went beyond mere age discrepancies. His report describes bark patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly, root systems that formed geometric patterns visible from elevated positions, and sap that glowed with its own faint luminescence during nighttime hours. Perhaps most unsettling was Dr. Hartwell's discovery of what he termed acoustic anomalies within the grove. Sound behaved strangely among the ancient pines, with whispered words carrying for extraordinary distances, while shouted commands would die away within feet of the speaker's lips. The botanist noted that certain combinations of sounds seemed to provoke responses from the forest itself, rustling movements among the upper branches that occurred even on windless days. Search teams also documented the complete absence of animal life within a mile radius of the grove. The forests of Vermont typically supported diverse populations of deer, bear, small mammals, and birds, yet the region around Millbrook Hollow had become utterly devoid of natural wildlife. Hunting dogs brought to assist in the search would refuse to enter the area, becoming agitated and uncontrollable when forced to approach the transformed landscape. Sheriff Bellwood's report includes testimonies from several searchers who claim to have heard voices calling from within the grove during evening hours. These accounts describe hearing what sounded like young Nathaniel's voice speaking in Latin, though the words seemed to come from every direction simultaneously rather than from any specific location among the trees. Attempts to follow these sounds deeper into the grove invariably led searchers to become disoriented and lost, requiring rescue teams to guide them back to safety. The psychological toll of the search operation became evident as the weeks progressed. Multiple searchers reported experiencing vivid nightmares featuring the missing family and disturbing visions of ancient rituals conducted among the pines. Several volunteers abandoned the effort entirely, claiming that their exposure to the grove had left them with persistent feelings of being watched and followed, even when far from the mountain region. Dr. Marcus Reed, a physician from Burlington who provided medical support for the search teams, documented a pattern of symptoms among the searchers that he termed hollow exposure syndrome. Affected individuals experienced insomnia, loss of appetite, and an obsessive need to return to the grove despite their obvious fear of the location. Dr. Reed's medical notes describe these symptoms as unlike any psychological condition he had encountered in his professional practice. The search operation was officially terminated on January 15, 1863, after 3 months of intensive effort yielded no trace of the Whitmore family. Sheriff Bellwood's final report concluded that the family had vanished completely, leaving behind only questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of rational investigation. The sheriff recommended that the Millbrook Hollow region be declared permanently off-limits to civilian access, a recommendation that was quietly implemented by state authorities. In the decades that followed, occasional attempts were made to revisit the site, but the forest seemed to actively resist such intrusions. Roads leading to the area would become impassable due to fallen trees or sudden erosion, while experienced guides would find themselves unable to locate landmarks they had known for years. The few individuals who successfully reached the grove reported that the ancient pines continued to grow and change, forming patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The official records of the Whitmore family disappearance were sealed by the Vermont State Legislature in 1875, citing sensitive information that might cause public distress if widely disseminated. These documents would remain classified until their accidental discovery during the renovation of the state capitol building in 1987, nearly 125 years after the events they described. The sealed records of the Whitmore investigation, discovered during the 1987 renovation of the Vermont state capitol, revealed evidence that the family's disappearance was neither isolated nor unprecedented. Hidden within the classified documents were references to similar incidents dating back to the earliest colonial settlements, suggesting a pattern of supernatural occurrences that had been systematically suppressed by authorities for over 2 centuries. Among the most significant discoveries was a collection of correspondence between Vermont officials and their counterparts in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, documenting coordinated efforts to contain information about what the documents referred to as linguistic manifestation events. These exchanges revealed that young Nathaniel Whitmore was not the first child to spontaneously develop fluency in ancient languages, nor was his subsequent disappearance unique among such cases. A memorandum dated December 1863, written by Vermont Governor Frederick Holbrook to Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, references at least 7 similar incidents recorded across New England since 1740. Each case involved a child between the ages of 4 and 7 who began speaking Latin, Greek, or other ancient tongues without prior exposure to these languages. In every documented instance, the affected families had disappeared without trace within months of the linguistic manifestations beginning. Dr. Cornelius Ashford, a physician and researcher commissioned by the Massachusetts colonial government in 1798 to investigate these phenomena, had compiled what he termed the Registry of Impossible Utterances, a catalogue of children whose supernatural linguistic abilities had attracted official attention. Dr. Ashford's report, preserved in the sealed files, describes a geographic pattern to these occurrences, with incidents clustered around remote mountain regions and areas of dense and ancient forest. Perhaps most disturbing were Dr. Ashford's notes regarding the environmental changes that accompanied each case. He documented reports of accelerated forest growth, altered wildlife behavior, and acoustic anomalies that persisted long after the affected families had vanished. The physician's investigation had led him to conclude that these linguistic manifestations were somehow connected to what he described as primordial intelligences dwelling within the deepest wilderness of the continent. The sealed records also contained a translated fragment of a document discovered among the possessions of a French missionary who had worked among Native American tribes in the Vermont region during the 1720s. Father Jean-Baptiste Dubois had recorded oral traditions describing children who served as voices for the Ancient Ones, beings that the indigenous peoples believed had inhabited the mountains since before human memory. These children, according to the tribal accounts, would speak in the old tongue that calls forth what sleeps beneath the roots and stones. The tribal traditions collected by Father Dubois described elaborate rituals designed to prevent such manifestations, including the placement of specific stones in geometric patterns and the burning of particular plant combinations during the dark moon. The missionary's notes suggest that these protective measures had been largely successful until the arrival of European settlers disrupted the traditional practices that had kept the ancient forces dormant. Modern researchers who gained access to the unsealed documents in the 1990s discovered additional evidence that the Whitmore case was part of a continuing pattern. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a linguist from Yale University who spent 5 years studying the available records, identified references to similar incidents occurring as recently as the 1940s. Her research revealed that government agencies had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for containing information about these events, including the relocation of affected families and the classification of related documents under national security provisions. Dr. Warren's linguistic analysis of the transcribed utterances from various cases revealed disturbing consistencies. The Latin spoken by affected children, while grammatically correct, contained elements that did not appear in any known classical texts. More troubling was her discovery that these utterances, when analyzed phonetically, shared structural similarities with reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language patterns that predated known civilization by millennia. The researchers' work was abruptly terminated in 1997 when Yale University received federal pressure to discontinue all research related to what was termed potentially destabilizing historical anomalies. Dr. Warren's files were confiscated, and she was transferred to a different department with no explanation provided to her academic colleagues. Subsequent attempts by other researchers to access the Whitmore documents have been unsuccessful, with authorities citing national security concerns. In recent years, amateur investigators and paranormal researchers have attempted to locate the original site of Millbrook Hollow using satellite imagery and GPS technology. These efforts have yielded conflicting results, with some claiming to have identified the location, while others maintain that the geographic coordinates appear to shift depending upon the method of observation used. Expedition attempts have consistently failed, with participants reporting equipment malfunctions, unexplained disorientation, and persistent technical difficulties that force them to abandon their search efforts. The few individuals who claim to have successfully reached the vicinity of the original Whitmore property describe finding a grove of ancient trees that defies conventional botanical explanation. These modern witnesses report experiencing auditory phenomena similar to those documented in historical accounts, distant voices speaking in unknown languages, and the sound of children reciting what sounds like Latin prayers or invocations. Most disturbing are recent reports suggesting that the phenomena associated with Millbrook Hollow may be expanding beyond its original location. Forest Service personnel have documented unusual growth patterns in several Vermont mountain regions, while local residents have reported hearing unexplained voices emanating from wooded areas during the darkest nights of each month. The truth about young Nathaniel Whitmore and his family may never be fully understood. Their disappearance remains one of Vermont's most persistent mysteries, a reminder that even in our modern age of scientific advancement and technological capability, there are forces in the world that resist explanation and events that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality itself. The ancient pines of Millbrook Hollow continue to grow in their impossible grove, reaching toward a sky that has witnessed secrets too terrible for human comprehension. Somewhere among those towering trees, the voice of a 5-year-old boy may still echo through the darkness, speaking words in a language older than civilization, calling forth responses from entities that have waited in the depths of the American wilderness since before recorded time began. In the end, perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, their secrets buried beneath centuries of growth in forests that remember what humanity has chosen to forget. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.